Syria is a region that has dealt with tremendous internal and external conflicts over the past 6 decades. Though this Middle Eastern country struggles with extreme external issues, the real strife lies within Syria's oppressive government. Syria's history has been a roller coaster of political protests, attacks, counterattacks, and serious bloodshed. In 1961, dissatisfied Syrian army officials composed a military coup in hopes of lessening the domination of Egyptian involvement in the United Arab Republic. The Syrian soldiers took control of Damascus, the capital city of Syria, thus dissolving the Union. In 1963, after army officers gained control of Damascus, power was given to the Ba'athist cabinet and President Amin al-Hafez. The Ba'aths were a socialist group that worked to unify Syria with the aid of nationalism. An early member of the Ba'ath Party was an Air Force general named Hafez al-Assad. As a part of both associations, Assad was in prime position to follow the 1966 coup d'etat, where he was quickly appointed Minister of Defense. He held this position during the Six-Day War and other disastrous events until he gained complete power as prime minister. Assad expanded his power even further once he became president in 1971. Many Syrians both feared and respected him as he stabilized the country's economic and political forces by advocating secularism, women's rights, and Syrian nationalism. Although Assad enforced industrialization and strengthened the country as a Middle Eastern power, he was criticized for his brutal strategies and attempts to subdue revolt and rebellion. As more Muslim groups continued to rebel against Assad's reign, he became less patient and more violent in his peace methods. A prime example is the Hama massacre. A resistance group known as the Muslim Brotherhood had started a campaign against Assad in 1976, and by 1982 he ordered troops into the Syrian town of Hama to end the resistance. An estimated 10,000 to 25,000 people were massacred during the operation. Despite the Hama massacre and Assad's continuous attempts to eliminate rebellion, pro-reform demonstrations turned into mass protests. Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad, took unnecessary brutal actions against demonstrators, including firing on crowds, unjust imprisonment, and torturing those already imprisoned. In 2011, internal conflict was steadily increasing amongst the Syrian people, who became inspired by a movement of anti-government protests known as the Arab Spring. The Syrian people demanded many things from Bashar al-Assad, including reform, the freedom of political prisoners, and even his own resignation.
Due to the increasing number of uprisings and protests, Assad started ordering troops to destroy opposition in cities such as Aleppo and Damascus. Assad's forces burned homes and property throughout the cities. They shot and arrested civilians, leading them off to prisons where many were mistreated and tortured, even to the point of death. After attacks by civilians against police forces in Tel Kalak, the Syrian army marched into the city in May 2011 and opened fire on the people. 3 people were killed while leaving a mosque and others died due to the shellings. Hundreds fled the city to seek safety, but in their escape, people still died and were seriously injured. The death count had come to 700 people. In June 2012, Syrian security forces surrounded the small town of Al-Kabir, near the city of Hama. Together with aiding Shabiha forces, they entered the town and started firing indiscriminately at the civilians. Witnesses testified to the great number of civilians killed, including children, by the soldiers' violence. The city of Raqqa was held by rebel forces that would not surrender nor stop their defensive attacks on military forces. Therefore, the Syrian Security Council decided to attack the city. The Syrian army led an air raid in 2013. A secondary school was hit by the attack and at least 12 people were killed. Many more were seriously injured from bombs. Syrian opposition forces met in Qatar in 2012 to discuss forming a coalition. Their main goal was to gain international recognition in order to receive financial and military-related support. Soon after, the U.S. recognized the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces as the legitimate representative for the Syrian people. When protests began in March 2011, Assad allowed troops to destroy cities and lead violent attacks on civilians in order to crush political opposition. Facing backlash, Assad attempted to decrease political suppression. He didn't succeed. When leaders from other nations and his own people asked him to step down, he refused and responded with even more violence. After an attack on Damascus on August 21, 2013 that injured and killed hundreds, victims were tested to see if missiles had transferred the chemical sarin into their blood. The victims' blood had sarin in it, proving Syria used chemical warfare on their own people. Inspections had been going on for 4 months before inspectors could prove the government's inhumane treatment of civilians. Following the confirmation of Syria's use of chemical weaponry, the United Nations set up the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to remove all chemical weapons in Syria. Neither the rebel forces nor the Syrian government would be able to have chemical weapons. In October 2013, Assad allowed international inspectors to begin destroying Syria's chemical weaponry. President Barack Obama warned Syria against using chemical warfare, saying the U.S. would have to respond with force if they did so. Obama declared that Syria would be held accountable for hideous acts against its own people, but he was unwilling to go to war over it. He decided a military strike would be the most effective but nonviolent option. In February 2014, the United Nations brought leaders from both sides of the Syrian civil war to Geneva for peace talks. The Syrian government accused the rebels of having unrealistic agendas and feels the need to fight these terrorists. On the other side, the rebels called for a transitional government, which Syria refused to accept. Thus, the Geneva peace talk proved unsuccessful.
Despite all attempts to end the Assad regime, a question still stands. What happens if it ends? Sadly, the answer is simple. More civil war, more killings, and stronger rebel armies. But the Syrian people and the UN forces will continue pushing for peace and order until it is achieved.